Sorry.
Hello? Hello, everyone. Welcome to Data and Society. My name is Rebecca Wexler. I'm a former fellow here and a current affiliate. I work on data technology and criminal justice issues. And it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you here for the final night of 3 Wednesdays, where we're featuring this year's cohort of fellows to talk about their work. So tonight we're going to hear from Veronica Avila, Cynthia Conti-Cook, and Jasmine McNealy. Welcome. So who has been here before to Data and Society? Wow, lots and lots of people. Okay. And how many people are visiting for the first time? Just, all right. Well, welcome. Welcome to the returns and to the newbies. And for those who don't know us yet, this is an independent, nonprofit research institution. It's focused on social and cultural issues that arise from data-centric technological development. And right now, Data and Society researchers are looking into issues ranging from health and data to labor futures, disinformation, AI, and algorithmic accountability. And if you're here today, you belong here in this wonderful, wonderful network and community. So if you'd like to sign up for invitations to more talks and events, please chat with Audrey Evans, the network engagement lead. You can stay engaged on social media as well. The Twitter handle is @Data Society. Tonight's hashtag is #Databite, and the website is www.datasociety.net. Okay, a couple of housekeeping notes as well. There are bathrooms here. They are behind you, that way, and to the left, and then another left. The talk tonight is going to be live streamed, and it's going to be transcribed. It'll be available afterwards as well. We have Hannah somewhere taking photographs right there. So if you'd like to opt out of having your photograph taken, you can put a dot on your name tag to opt out, right over there, dots. Okay, so now for our first speaker, Veronica Avila, I'm going to introduce her talk, A Recipe for Better Restaurant Industry Workforce Conditions. Veronica is a labor rights organizer and researcher. She is currently the campaign co-manager with the Restaurant Opportunities Centers United, ROC, which is a restaurant workers center that's committed to improving wages and working conditions for the nation's restaurant workforce. Prior to her work in research, she was a labor rights organizer. She organized with several service worker unions and the Chicago chapter of ROC. So welcome, Veronica.
Is this fine?
Yeah, as Rebecca mentioned, so I work with the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, and as the name implies, we're actually a sector-specific worker center. So we focus on improving the workplace conditions in the restaurant industry. And while we are primarily composed of restaurant workers across the country, we actually have offices in about 9 different cities across the country. We have 25,000 restaurant worker members, but we also really make it a point to engage different stakeholders that obviously have the capacity to shape the well-being of the restaurant industry and implement models to profit that are what we call high road. So we also work with employers. We work with about 750 employers across the country. They comprise a network that we call RAISE, which is a beautiful acronym. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's something about raising the industry standards. And then we also have a consumer roundtable that's called Diners United. One of the ways that we know change happens in the restaurant industry is through the powers of consumer demanding change in the workplace. So I want to maybe start the talk by focusing on why ROC exists and why ROC focuses on the restaurant industry and why you should care about the restaurant industry. The restaurant industry is actually one of the country's largest and fastest growing industries. There are about 14 million restaurant workers across the country. In New York, it's over 1 million. This is one of the largest restaurant industries in the country. And we also know that the industry is incredibly profitable. So we know that recently there was a shift in the way that we eat, and in 2017, people started to dine out way more than they ate in their homes, so that caused a boom in the workforce. We also know that the industry is incredibly profitable. So every year, the National Restaurant Association, which is the corporate industry trade lobby of the restaurant industry, releases projections on like the state of the industry. And this year, they project that there will be about $863 billion in sales in our industry. And that's a 3% increase from last year's sales. So it's thriving, it's enduring, it's growing. It's a source of employment for so many people. Oh yeah, there. I missed the slide. So it's actually also the source of the majority of new jobs in the country. So in 2017, I think actually maybe 2016, this industry had what represented about 10% of the new jobs that were created. So it's just booming, and I'll get into that more and why that matters. But I actually wanted to ask people, has anyone here ever worked in the restaurant industry? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, so that's kind of reflective. About half of the country at some point in their life has worked in the restaurant industry, and actually is even higher for women. About 60% of women at some point in their life have worked in the restaurant industry. So while I've just sort of laid out that the industry is booming, it's growing, it's really profitable, sales are increasing, it's also a really perfect nexus of inequality. Unfortunately, even though sales are booming, they're growing, this is also the industry that houses some of the lowest paid jobs in the country. So 8 out of 10 of the lowest paid occupation are tip roles, and I'll get into what that means in a sec. And 8 out of 20, 9 out of 20 of the lowest paid occupations in the country are restaurant jobs. So this industry also houses the percentage, or the number of workers that earn, like 65% of workers earn below minimum wage are employed in food service and food prep occupations. So this is an alarmingly low-wage industry, and it really does keep people in poverty. People that are in the industry experience poverty at the higher rates in the general workforce. They rely on public supports at higher rates in the general workforce, and they sort of live this enduring life of economic instability. And one of the reasons that that's even possible is that the restaurant industry is also the employer of the largest number of tip workers. And so in our country, the federal wage laws state that if you earn more than $30 a month in tips, that your employer can pay you a tip wage. And federally, that can be as low as $2.13. So in about 23 states across the country, including New Jersey, tip workers, who are nail salon workers, servers, bussers, delivery workers, valet drivers, or valet workers, can earn as little, their employer can pay them as little as $2.13 an hour, which means that tips obviously are, the majority of their income. So that's part of the reason why part of our policy priorities, or actually our core campaign, has been to pass what we call one fair wage. So it is essentially legislation that would move the sub-minimum wage, which is what we call the tip wage, to eventually match the general minimum wage. So it's not asking for more than what a state already has, and it's a gradual phase-in. So that sounds like a really simple ask, and it sounds like kind of a no-brainer considering that the base pay for the bulk of this workforce is $2.13. But that's actually a really, really hard fight that we've had, and I'll get into that in a second. But as we started the fellowship, we really wanted to explore the impact of tech on the workforce, and we began this at a moment where we felt a surge in the momentum around one fair wage. So 16 states introduced legislation to phase out the use of the sub-minimum wage, which was really exciting considering that historically no one really considers this workforce or sort of has this perception of it as a transient workforce, or that tip workers are mainly servers who make tons of money because at one point, maybe in college, you worked at a bar and that's the perception that you carry. So this was actually really monumentous, and we also are a part of 2 federal bills that one of them we expect will pass the House with one fair wage intact, and that'll be the first time this has ever happened in the history of this work. Okay, so as we engaged in the one fair wage campaigns, we saw that employers were really using the threat of automation as a way to thwart our organizing efforts. They were instilling a serious fear in workers, saying that if you support one fair wage, a tablet is going to take over your job, as if literally the exchange ratio was 1 tablet to 1 worker. And so we wanted to take this time to explore, well, how are workers engaging with tech in the workforce? And we also were dealing a lot with misinformation, so I won't get into that now, but we also wanted to understand how people consume media and how they engaged with media. So we did a survey of over 1,000 restaurant workers across the country. When we do research, we do participatory-based research, which means we work with restaurant workers to collect surveys. So the bulk of these were collected through our membership. And we found that that the tablets were already here. The tablet takeover had already happened. People were already engaging with this in their workforce, and the industry was still growing. So that was something that was a bit sort of startling to see, considering the hysteria that the industry managed to sort of arise while we were having these policy campaigns. So we found that 54% of restaurant workers reported that their management used scheduling software, so people were reliant on algorithmic management. But we also found that 90% of workers reported that their management actually considered their scheduling considerations. So that was something that was really relieving to hear. But considering that if you're dependent on tips, you likely want to work weekends and evenings, it's probably what most people requested. We also found that 13% of workers reported that their restaurant have self-ordering kiosks. And this was predominantly in quick serve segments, so McDonald's, et cetera. We found that 14% of workers reported having tableside tablets in their workforce, and the majority of those workers were in places like Applebee's, what we call casual dining. So not necessarily surprising, because when you go to those places, you see the tablets all the time on the table. So about half of the respondents that said they had tablets were from that sector. We also realized that the people that had tablets had some sort of quota that they had to meet for customer surveys. So while a good majority didn't have to have any surveys filled out, a significant number had either to meet a quota every shift or meet one every week. And this, becomes alarming because the results are sometimes often used to influence the number of hours that you get, influence your schedule. So we found that for many, many workers, more than we anticipated, nearly half, they said that the results of their survey somehow influenced their schedule. So I'm going to zoom through the rest of this. But mostly what we saw was that tech was already penetrating the industry. It had been for decades, and that sort of that employers were largely also using tech to add new revenue streams, to have customer loyalty programs. The majority have online ordering or delivery programs. And so we really realized that the threat of automation, what it really did was sort of magnify these existing insecurities about economic stability. So it really sort of manifested this power imbalance that existed in the workplace. And so, I'll wrap up soon because I think my time is done. But I think one of the core takeaways that we found was that conversations about tech and the future of work really, really do have to center or begin with reflections on already existing workplace inequalities. And I didn't get into this whole second half, but we really find that the restaurant industry, it began in the late 1800s, and the tip wage itself is a vestige of slavery. Newly freed slaves were the first tip workers, they were the sleeping car porters, they were working in restaurants, and that to understand why the wage has been able to continue for over 130 years since the advent of this work, and why workers have really only experienced a 0.5% increase in the last 130 years, you really have to understand that what underpins this is racism and sexism, and that the sort of continuation of the tip wage also relies on that. So we really want to echo that that's one of the things that we realize is that there's a really strong need to reflect on the current imbalances in the workplace to understand the future of work.
Veronica. Really fascinating presentation. So next we're going to have Cynthia Conti-Cook, and her talk is called Hidden Misconduct, Police Data Protection in the United States. Cynthia is a staff attorney, there's a chair, at New York City's Legal Aid Society's Special Litigation Unit, where she oversees the COP Accountability Project and Database, leads impact litigation and law reform projects on issues that involve policing, data collection, risk assessment instruments, the criminal justice system generally, as well as supporting the legal aid staff in their trial offices on their cases. She's also my former supervisor. Take it away, Cynthia.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I went a little bit too forward there. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Data and Society and to everyone that helps put this event together and helped us all meet our deadlines patiently. My year has focused here at Data and Society on a high level on how data tools and technology are changing the criminal justice system, whether through the introduction of risk assessment instruments, through studying the procurement of private technology used in policing and prosecutions, or the sophisticated military-grade surveillance technologies that are used in public and digital spaces by police. But the majority of my research this past year focused on an aspect of the criminal justice system that for a long time has really lacked data, and that is police misconduct. My talk today will explore how this data gap came to be and how police unions have long made claim to the right to be forgotten regarding their misconduct data decades before the GDPR was passed in Europe. This raises important lessons for us about how government actors have exploited privacy rhetoric to cover up human rights violations. So now the European flag. When the right to be forgotten was accepted by the European Court of Justice in 2014, many categorically denied whether such a concept might make its way to America. There were a lot of headlines like this, that Americans don't have that option because they said the First Amendment and its protection of the freedom of speech and the role we think it plays in our informed democracy will prevent that. A Time article even declared Americans will never have a right to be forgotten because, as one person who was interviewed was quoted to say, in the US, free speech sort of trumps privacy. The takeaways from these conclusions are seemingly twofold. One, that the freedom to access information in America is more important than in other countries, and that in America, people are more exposed because they have little recourse when their prior bad acts are reported. But at least one scholar, Professor Amy Gaja, in a 2017 article, Privacy, Press, and the Right to be Forgotten in the US, really challenges both of those conclusions. In her article, she states that the right to be forgotten has actually been on US shores for centuries, she says, and she walks through a number of cases where courts have weighed privacy interests against press interests and decided that privacy wins out. She dates these cases as far back as 1890. And so where my research comes into is that my research is about information protection statutes and policies pushed by police unions across the United States for the past 5 decades. And that has shown that police officers, more than any other public servant, have established confidentiality statuses for their prior misconduct information so that it never even hits private papers, news articles, the internet in the first place. So to the extent that the First Amendment protects prior misconduct from being erased in the United States, it certainly hasn't stopped our own government actors from erasing their own misconduct data from public consciousness. This has caused a large data gap between police misconduct and the potential heavily data-driven police reforms that could be based on data of police misconduct. And this is in a system where criminal justice statistics, risk assessment instruments, and other data-driven tools are really being introduced into the system at an alarming speed. So it's this background of a country that believes its elevated access to information above privacy rights in similar arenas in the criminal justice system at large is collecting and using criminal justice data in 1,000 new ways. And I research police misconduct information in contrast to that. Its collection and access, lack of access really, and how we understand it. Police rely on privacy rhetoric to make these arguments despite multiple court decisions that have consistently rejected the idea that on-duty misconduct could ever be considered private. This privacy rhetoric ramped up in the 60s and the 70s with freedom of information laws as they began to be introduced, as well as when police officers first started to unionize. Their first major legislative effort was actually called the Police Officer Bill of Rights. And that included sealing, expungement, and privacy rights for their misconduct information histories. And New York State's Civil Rights Law 50A was one of their first wins. It was passed in 1976. One researcher even recently argued that sharing police misconduct information with the public violates officer privacy and causes unfair reputational damage to them. And police have done an amazing PR job of building on this aura of privacy rights around their misconduct information. I wrote a response to this argument, published this winter with my alma mater, CUNY Law, where I researched how police unions and representatives have articulated their privacy rights. And at Data and Society, we have a lot of conversations about what digital privacy means and about how it's not just about what we as individuals do, but about how we interconnect with our network and how our digital privacy is only really as protected as our network is. And let me tell you, police have excelled at this type of rhetoric and have really taken that ball and ran with it. It's exactly the types of arguments that they make. In California, an officer said that maintaining confidentiality of misconduct records best serves the important policy goal of maintaining confidence in law enforcement. The Sergeant Benevolence Association president, Ed Mullins, put an even finer point on it last April with this opinion piece in the New York Post, where he described 50A as having been enacted in recognition of the unique nature of the work of law enforcement professionals and first responders who risk their lives daily for the common good, and this is the most important part, and who can't do their job without the community's support. What the union is claiming there is that the public is safer being in the dark about police misconduct information because it's dangerous for the public to question or doubt or distrust government authority. But this is not actually about privacy at all. It's about preserving the state power of anonymity and their ability to commit misconduct and remain faceless or nameless. The police are quick to weaponize misconduct, on the other hand. Eric Garner, who was killed by Daniel Pantaleo 5 years ago in a chokehold, wasn't dead for 24 hours before his sealed arrest history, theoretically protected by a different privacy statute, was all over the internet. But when we sued Daniel Pantaleo for his misconduct history, we sued the Civilian Complaint Review Board for his misconduct history, the city fought us. We won initially, but they appealed, and we lost under appeal because of state law 50A. Because of 50A, Pantaleo can confidently believe that no matter what the outcome of the administrative trial is that he's currently facing, that's concluded just recently, there will be no official record of it available publicly, absent any leak. The mother of Eric Garner, who sat through every day of that trial, does not know today if she will ever learn what actually happened. So the right to be forgotten has been weaponized as early as 1976 by public officials in New York State to cover up their misconduct in the name of privacy rights. As we participate in conversations about this right, we should consider who has the resources to fight for their records to be erased and how the disparities of those resources will leave some of our histories appearing spotless, while others with less will struggle to escape the risk scores, gang database entries, and rap sheets that will follow them through life. So what are we doing about it? We're definitely in Albany fighting for repeal of State Law 50A. California successfully passed a law that allowed more public access to its police misconduct information, but only for certain categories. And in many other states, there's similar laws, and we are trying to look to creating a broader legislative effort towards changing those. We're also trying to raise more public awareness around this issue. The New York Times did an editorial last week supporting full repeal of 50A. But in the meantime, my work is focused on how to fill these data gaps without waiting for the government to give us access to information about their own misconduct. So several databases have been curated by non-governmental groups and were featured in this article in Undark magazine 2 weeks ago, maybe. The Legal Aid Society, where I work, rolled out a Defender database in 2016, joining one other public database of internal records from Chicago's Invisible Institute. That was released in 2015. So in our Defender database, we took information from our cases, from public sources like lawsuit databases, news sites, and payroll information, and we used it to create officer profiles for our attorneys to search. Then, following the Invisible Institute's lead in March 2019, we rolled out a public version of our database using only the publicly available sources, and that focused mostly on federal civil rights lawsuit data for a 3-year period. Our website allows viewers to search through lawsuits by patterns of misconduct, so the type of force used, the type of abusive language, criminal charges that the people were falsely accused of, and other types of aspects of each case. You can look locally at lawsuits filed in specific precincts to understand what is happening in a very specific geographic area. And of course, it allows people to look up officer misconduct profiles. A social network analysis adds these 3 dimensions together, giving users the ability to understand what a PBS study actually just revealed, that officer misconduct tends to spread like contagion. Up next, we hope to extend the capacity of Defender organizations to host and maintain Defender databases, as well as starting up public websites with the data they collect from public sources. The starred states on this map are places we've already begun conversations with Defender and civil rights organizations around new databases, and we hope these efforts will fuel a national effort to push changes into the laws, policies, and norms, and afford greater transparency of police misconduct records and support a truly informed democracy.
Thank you, Cynthia. So next up, our final speaker is Jasmine McNealy with a talk titled Cryptoparty as Rent Party. Jasmine is currently an assistant professor of telecommunication at the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications, a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, a fellow at the Stanford University Digital Civil Society Lab, chair of the Communication Law and Policy Division of the International Communication Association, and recently completed a 6-month term as a visiting researcher with Spotify Research, working with the Algorithmic Bias Squad. She studies information, communication, and technology with a view toward influencing law and policy. Her research focuses on privacy, on online media, communications, and culture. So help me welcome Jasmine, please.
So good afternoon. So it's not lost on me that today is Juneteenth. So happy Juneteenth, you all. If you don't know what Juneteenth is, June the 19th, 1865, the last people to find out that they were free, so slaves in Galveston Bay, Texas, found out the U.S. Army had to trot into town and tell them that they were free. And so what I submit to you is that we have there a demonstration of a failure, right? A failure of information, or access to information, access to data. Because slaves had to rely on their masters who, at best, were apathetic to their plight, at worst had their worst interests at heart, right? To tell them that they no longer were in bondage. So we have a failure there, right? So what I want to talk about today are failures, but how communities are picking up the slack where there is a failure. Failure of government, failure of civil society agencies. So what I'm interested is in information, particularly the disposition of information as it relates to technology, emerging technology and media. What I want to know is how people and organizations actually behave so that when there is law, when there is policy to influence, we actually know how people behave and the influence of law and policy and technology on people, but also how people influence technology. So my talk today is Cryptoparty as Rent Party, with the subtitle Community as Technology, and peace to Rigo for that subhead right there. So I think it's important to think about community as technology. What is technology? But technology is just a set of processes, a process that we go through to create something. We think of technology only in terms, I think, as the digital technology, so this Mac right here, or this TV, these screens. But technology is more than that. It's broader than that. And I think that's really important when we think about it, particularly when we think about critically about what technology is and why the rent party. So how do I get to this research in the first place? One of my favorite and foundational pieces was written by an urbanist / sociologist / anthropologist, Abdul Malik Simon. And this is a quote from it. It's a paper called People as Infrastructure, Intersecting Fragments in Johannesburg. And so what Simon did was he went to Joburg. He went to Joburg and he studied. He did some participant observation, interviews, what was happening in, way back in 2004, what was happening in Johannesburg, South Africa. So if you read the opening abstract, he talks about Joburg being as far away from the stereotypical, what we think of as an African village with huts and those kinds of things. It's a cosmopolitan place, but at the same time, post-apartheid, you had the kind of ruins of urbanization. You had white populations who had moved out of certain areas, and you had governments who were failing to provide the things that people need to help run a city or help make a city work and help make all the people in a city be able to function. But what you had instead was infrastructure that popped up to make the city run. And so this is a quote that I find fascinating from that piece. And he says, a platform for providing and reproducing life in the city. In other words, a specific economy of perception and collaborative practice is constituted through the capacity of individual actors to circulate across and become familiar with a broad range of spatial, residential, economic, and transactional positions. So where people have found that government fails, where civil society fails. We think of infrastructure only in the physical, but there is a social infrastructure that undergirds all of this, and that can step in, or does step in, has to step in, for things to run for the people in the cities. Now, I know I'm talking about city a lot and urban spaces, and there's a reason for that, but I think this also applies to the suburban or the ex-urban or the rural as well. There are social networks. There is social infrastructure that props up life in these areas to make it function for the people who live there. Otherwise, it would not do so. And so when I think of people as infrastructure, again, I think of, and this graph is going to change your life. When I think of, we think of bridges, we think of the physical, right? But where there's a failure of the physical, I have a hole in the bridge, right? So people have stepped in. People fill in the gap, right? And this is going to be important. So a failure in Joburg was that when white people moved, you had a lack of chain stores. Grocery stores would leave, right? So you'd have places where people wouldn't be able to get groceries. So you have markets popping up, right? So that's the people as infrastructure, people seeing a need and filling in because of failures. And I submit to you that we have some failures, right, that are happening right now that we'll talk about in a second. But the project I'm looking at is related to not just this city, but related to across the United States and a little bit of Canada as well. And how, as technology has emerged and been deployed by not just city governments, but corporations and other organizations as well, how their failures with technology, or at least how our approaches to technology, and how that implicates surveillance. It not just implicates surveillance, it is surveillance, right? These technologies have disparate impacts on particular marginalized groups. I'm thinking of Black folks and Latinx people and queer people and religious minorities and a lot of other groups that traditionally have been marginalized. But the impact on these groups is disparate in comparison to what we think of as mainstream. And I submit to you, like, from this research that I've been doing, that what is happening now is the emergence of community infrastructure, or I would say reemergence of community infrastructure that is filling in the gaps where these failures are happening. And so I analogize it to the rent party. So we're in New York City. If we take the R, the W, beyond like the construction happening and some of the other subways, we can go up to Uptown and we could go to Harlem. And Harlem is a storied place. It is a place that you can read about. You can talk about the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, and all of these other great people. But Harlem is a product and benefited from a movement of people from south to north. So both social and economic refugees, quite frankly, from very real issues that were happening. And so you have this abundance of people who were going north, not just to Harlem, but Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and California. And they moved into these spaces because the North was promised to them as a place with a whole lot of economic opportunity. But when they got there, the same old oppressive forces were at work, right? So the North was not utopia. And so people were living in these conditions where it cost a lot. So the rent is high now, the rent was high back then as well. And so to sustain themselves, people would come together, communities would come together, and they would throw parties, a rent party, right? Which is exactly as it is. How are you gonna pay your rent? You throw a party, people pay a cover, you drink, you eat, you listen to music, you Lindy Hop, you dance, right? And then you go to church the next day as if nothing happened. So this is a painting, you've probably seen it before. It is Mabel Dwight's 1929 painting of Harlem Rent Party. And so people would go to these parties. But if you look at what a rent party had, there are a couple of keys that I want to talk about that are important. So number one key was that it was hyper-local, right? So I'm talking specifically about Harlem, but other places as well. You don't have a rent party just any old place. You need to bring people to the spot where people need to pay their rent. It was a house or somebody's house, and you wanted people to come to that particular location, hyperlocality. There was a value exchange. So to dance the night away, to eat, to drink, you needed to pony up some money, right? So there is value exchange, and that's important. And there were goals, community and sustainability. So we wanted to keep the people that we knew in their house. We wanted to sustain the community that we were building. We had already left the community down south. We wanted to keep them in the community up north. And then virality, right? So virality meaning we want a whole lot of people to come out and support. But also, you should know that rent parties weren't just parties for making rent, that some musicians that we know well became famous from playing at rent parties. We're thinking of Duke Ellington. These are people who became famous playing at the rent parties. And so these factors are really important because you see these same factors with today's technology. So the project I did this year and continuing to do is a look at the emergence/reemergence of community groups and people whose whose mission it is to educate their communities about the very real dangers of surveillance technologies, both corporate and kind of civic related technologies. And so what they'll do is they'll put on things like crypto parties. They'll put on things like kind of Skillshare, how to use your technology safety, how to use your phone safely, how to use the Onion browser, right, the Tor, and how to think about what's happening. And then they'll also go to the city council meeting and say, you know what, we think that you all shouldn't be allowed to use ShotSpotter. We think that, you know, the government shouldn't be using facial technology. So if you've been paying attention to what happened in San Francisco recently, the result of the ban was because of community groups working really hard over a number of years saying, you know what, we can't have this in our community. So these are the functions of these groups. And what I've been able to do is interview members of these groups and people who are doing these crypto parties themselves, and to see why they are participating. I'm gonna skip this, but note that all four of those things apply. But I wanna leave you with a quote from an actual interview I did. And they say, so many people I know constantly feel surveilled, constantly feel the shame and paranoia, are dealing with PTSD. I'm not trying to add to that. I actually really want to live in a world of trust. The reason that they give for participating, for holding these Skillshares, for teaching people how to safely use their technology is because they want to change the community. They want to be able to give to their friends, to give to these people a sense of trust in the world, to be able to live in a world more free than they were. And as we related back to Juneteenth and to the rent party, we think about freedom. Freedom from surveillance, but also freedom to just live without the weight of being watched, the weight of always being surveilled or always thought of in a negative light. And I think that's an important thing. So how am I doing this in the future? I'm continuing to interview people and to watch and to participate in these parties for continuing research. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of our speakers. I was struck a little bit that we heard about gaps from two of you, from both Jasmine and Cynthia, one data gaps, one infrastructure gaps, and then all three of you had presentations where it's humans, it's people who are filling in those gaps. For Jasmine, you're talking about crypto parties, Veronica passing legislation, and Cynthia collecting data. So really, really wonderful presentations. I wanted to ask initially if any of the panelists have questions for one another. And if not, that's okay. I have a couple questions for you. No. Okay, fine. So just to start out with Veronica, actually. So you talked about the introduction of some new technologies into the restaurant industry. You said that technology's been there for a long time, actually. And do you think that these technologies are necessarily bad? Is automation inherently problematic? And also, more particularly, does it harm all workers equally, or do some workers win?
I would say that low-wage workers of color and immigrants and women are probably not in a winning situation. But I will start by saying that I think inherently tech and automation isn't going to sort of, at least in our sector, displace all people. I think one of the things that we know that we've seen is that what tech has done is magnify existing inequalities, and workplace conditions and worker well-being is fundamentally about power. So who has the power to shape the economy and who has the power to shape the existing tech terrain? And so since for us, we know that the Restaurant Association is fiercely powerful. They have a tremendous lobby. They've managed to keep tip wages in place for over 130 years and federal federally. There hasn't been an increase since 1991. We've seen that they've normalized a sub-minimum wage, and we've seen that has moved into different sectors. So for example, if we focus on delivery workers, folks that deliver food through apps, we've seen that the penetration of a sub-minimum wage in its own way, right? There are tons of issues there around misclassification, but there's fundamentally a notion that an employer can divert its obligation. It could essentially outsource who has to pay the worker. And so apps like DoorDash, Seamless through Relay, et cetera, are taking the norms that the restaurant industry have established. They're taking sort of that power, and they're creating another expectation that this new segment of workers are going to primarily depend on tips. They're going to race through bad weather to chase a tip to make ends meet. And so that's, one of the ways that we've seen it amplify existing inequalities, right? So workers of color are predominantly restaurant workers, and they're also predominantly delivery workers. And so that we've seen that there's just a clear imbalance of power that we've seen really shape out.
And actually, Taeyun was just telling me earlier about some new technologies that are going to also be transnational potentially, and have robots delivering.
So one thing that's worth mentioning is that no other country in the world essentially has a tip wage, and delivery workers, in other parts of the world are also rising up. And so what we've seen that the industry has also managed to do is create a really disparate and disaggregate workforce. So the restaurant industry isn't, this is also like just answering my own question, but the restaurant industry isn't unionized, and I think you really see that power imbalance. So it'll be interesting to see how that's regulated in other places that have been more worker friendly, and where the restaurant industry hasn't had the same power to shape what it means to be a worker.
Thank you. And Jasmine, one of the things I was struck about your talk was the broad historical scope of your description of technology and of this concept of people as infrastructure. And so that also resonated a little bit with Veronica's talk, because you also talked about technology being present in the restaurant industry for a long time. Do you have any sense of where the limits are on what you would describe as technology or people acting as infrastructure?
Well, I think people as infrastructure is imperfect, right? So people can fill in the gaps, but they're not what's supplied is not perhaps the most efficient, perhaps not the most effective. So where people are filling in, it's great that they're doing it, but I think we still need government to move in certain ways on the behalf of the people they're supposed to be representing. So if a failure, for example, is that, you are using a technology, for example, they just rolled out Omni, right, in New York City, where it's the tap. It's the cashless, the contactless, technology for the metro, right? But a failure in that is, first of all, if everybody's going to have to use it, that means everybody's going to have to get a card. But it's a surveillance tool. I mean, can we be honest? It's a surveillance tool. And there are cameras attached to that system. And there is, if you look at the privacy policy, which I did for some reason, it says it collects other data as deemed appropriate and will share data as deemed appropriate. What does that mean? That's a failure, because you are dealing with people's expectations, and you're not actually telling them. So where people fill in is, I can tell you that this is what's going to happen with Omni, but unless I can stop that from happening, my filling in as infrastructure is imperfect. So I can help you, I can try to reduce harm, I can tell you maybe you should still use cash or something like that. But it doesn't take away all of the harm for all of the people. And I think that's an important thing. Yeah.
I love that. I want to write that into all my future contracts. It'll just be like, I can do this and other things as appropriate. Are there questions in the audience right now that anybody's dying to ask for any of the panelists? I'll get back to Cynthia. I've not forgotten about her. Yes.
This is for Cynthia, so I may be getting ahead of things. Okay. In regards to policing data, what can like tech workers and folks who work with data do in that space? I know it's kind of a vague question, but that is the question.
To support, can I ask a question back? To support the collection of police misconduct information? Yeah, right. So there's a lot of different movements that have been centered around empowering communities to fill in the data gaps that exist around police misconduct. CopWatch is a really great example of that. And so for CopWatch, if you haven't heard of it, it's a lot of people who have organized themselves in communities that are experiencing excessive and abusive policing, and they're taking the technology either of their phones or of affordable cameras, and in a very organized way going about finding police officers who are interacting with community members and then creating data, right? So there's the generation of data through CopWatch groups, and they have worked with El Grito, which is a local group in Brooklyn, to create best practices for not just performing CopWatch, but also for archiving all of the video footage that these local groups are getting, and then have a great deal of information that they're not quite sure how to manage, how to organize and archive in a way that will be preserved and possibly useful. So CopWatching is a really great example of how communities have taken back the power to document what they experience as police abuse. And our databases, the Invisible Institute database and the database at the Legal Aid Society, are other examples of really redefining what it means to have misconduct data. The problem with, of course, government-generated data is that they then control and have really a monopoly over it and describing it and organizing it. What we've done by basing our website on lawsuit data, partially just because we can't get internal misconduct data, is to say that lawsuit data has value, and that by itself is something that the police have argued against. So I think partially it's about creating systems through which community groups can define what reliable data means for them, and rejecting the idea that only government can define how to collect and create credible misconduct data about itself.
Hi. I think I noticed like a sort of many prevailing themes, I guess, across all of you. And I guess one of them, and something that I myself have always come back to, is the fact that technology, I guess you're defeating the misconception that technology is, once it's implemented, it's like the agent of change. It's going to be the catalyst of change, but actually kind of what a scholar like Lisa Gittleman, I don't know if you know her, but she had written a book called Always Already Knew. And basically the concept is that, it's technologies are not acultural, not ahistorical, not amoral, that they are actually like looking at them as sort of like an avenue in which you can understand already existing cultural norms and societal sort of, it's societal norms. And so I'm interested, this is sort of like a personal problem that I have, is that within academia, I sort of am operating within the sphere that, technology is, has all these cultural implications, that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so I'm wondering, this is sort of related in the sense that I'm wondering with you guys how you kind of speak to, if you do at all, to those who actually are implementing technologies, right? Those who are actually the ones that are, at DeepMind and Google making artificial intelligence, how you can sort of at the same time work and collaborate together with them to tell them and make them understand that just because it's a really great innovation that you're doing doesn't mean that it's going to solve all these social cultural problems.
That's funny. So we have scholars out there that are doing that exact work, Safia Noble, Virginia Eubanks, all of these scholars right now that are shouting, hey, anything you make. So if I may say Marshall McLuhan, like media, if media's and technology just extensions of ourselves, right? So there's never anything that you can create that doesn't have your fingerprint on it, whatever that fingerprint is, and doesn't make some kind of impact on something. And so I think from that perspective, that if we are teaching or at least attempting to make creators engage with the fact that if you are making something, you're making it for a reason, and that reason has the marks of your life and experience on it, and your life and experience is not representative of everybody else's life and experience, I think it will take a lot, because we've had conversations without tech about the impacts of certain choices for a long time. And tech only amplifies the impact of those choices. I think what we have to do, and I think Mutale talked about this earlier, and is shift culture, shift ways of thinking about creation. And then also, at some point, the law has to do something. Government has to do something. I'm not jumping on the breakup train. I'm not saying this should happen, but government has to, in some way, step in where what we're attempting to do, where academics, where researchers, where public scholars, where activists can't fill in the gap, government needs to. Yeah.
I'm going to, just add to from the worker perspective. I mean, one of the things, ROC is a worker center, and we do participatory-based research. And I think for us, we've really grappled with sometimes reckless intellectual questions that have real implications on the organizing work that we're doing. So I think that I would really, really push people to maybe not always study folks and begin to have. A lot of times workers are the subjects of reports, and that's fine because we do need the data, we do need to make changes, but we also need to stop having conversations for and about people and without them. And so I think that's one thing that we'd love to see more is workers in these spaces that are defining the future of work or having these conversations, have the people that are actually affected at the table when we're having these conversations. Because these are structural problems that are really gonna need collective conversations and collective solutions.
You actually are building some of it yourself.
We are, but I was going to actually answer with the risk assessment sort of critic hat on, to say that also I would challenge people who are being put in the positions to create those types of tools in systems that they don't understand the underlying problems of, to say no and not create those systems because of the potential for actually amplifying the harm, and not understanding. So for example, in the context of risk assessment instruments in the criminal justice system, without understanding the reliability of data that's generated by police and prosecutors, data scientists should not be building systems that are automating the decisions that are made upon data that those actors are creating, and often creating with very divergent motivations, I'll say. So I would, in addition to saying that there's much more complexity to the underlying causes than technology could ever fix, encourage people who are being assigned these projects to really push back, and if the data does, under scrutiny, not stand up to something that could reliably be automated, that just should not happen.
Hey, amazing talks, thank you. So I have a question kind of for Cynthia and Veronica, which is, Veronica had a slide that she kind of sped through, but I noticed that in the reviews in the surveys, like a large number of workers could see the reviews of their colleagues, and I was really curious because I imagine that is not the case for police records. If you guys could talk a little bit about did the workers feel like that was intentional, or was it just like people didn't care enough? And kind of, if you both could talk maybe a little bit about your thoughts on like how privacy policies are crafted and how that changes with who is involved and who is being surveilled.
Yeah, I think for me, it's also who can be shamed. And so maybe that's also, Cynthia pointed out, it's like workers can be shamed. And so the fact that they have access to their reviews and their coworkers do as well, because customers frequently leave inappropriate comments or judge people, and that's for public consumption. And so there's a bit of a shaming element that can happen as a source of indirect management control. So I think it sort of dovetails off of what Cynthia said of who can be shamed, and those are largely people of color. They're women, they're immigrants, they're low-wage workers, and other people.
Yeah, and in contrast, right, police officers have, to some extent, they've conflated a lot of different privacy arguments into this collective sense of we all need to have privacy. And, those two things operate sort of in a singularity as applied to police officers only, where there is a collective sense of privacy that if you know about one officer's misconduct, then you will think poorly of every police officer that you are interacting with and not respect the authority of them in the way that they need you in order to obey, right? And that kind of power is on the exact opposite side, right, of someone who is a server at a restaurant, and it's even though they're called public servants. And in other states, so there's a greater ability to at least put a claim in, to make a claim to the court if they reject a freedom of information request, to say, but this is in the public interest. And New York does not have that type of public interest exception, but in some other states, at least if you have the resources and the wherewithal to file a petition in court, you could try to force the court to understand the reason that you want to see the records. And so perhaps in a different state, we could make the public interest claim to, Officer Pantalio's civilian complaint substantiated history. But that kind of right to understand, or the right to leave a comment even, right, is something that is controlled really closely. So the police officers across the country, they all keep their internal misconduct records very separately. There is no ability to sort of collectively understand what police officers do in any systemic way nationally. And interestingly, in the Invisible Institute that did get 30 years of internal misconduct information and has had that public for several years, what they found out was that police officers are giving them a lot of feedback about how informational it is for them, how informative it is for them to be able to know what the police officer who they're assigned to be with that evening, what their misconduct history is, because they want to know what kind of adventure they're going to be taken on that night and to be prepared for it. And so even amongst other police officers, they're not privy to one another's misconduct histories, let alone the direct supervisors of them. And so the type of anonymity that's built into policing systems in this country, not in every state, but certainly in New York, has only amplified the amount of abuse that police officers can take out on civilians.
I think this might be our last question.
So this question is for you, Cynthia. So I'm not very familiar with what police misconduct data itself looks like, or like what's included in that. But I do know a concern that I've heard and that I kind of have as it relates to expanded information about police officers and what they do, is that it can expand what we know and what we see as it relates to the people that they're policing and the people that they interact with. And so my question, I guess, is that sort of a concern that's embedded in this? And B, are there ways to, whether those are frameworks or just specific things that occur, ways to expand what we know about what police officers are doing without violating the privacy of the people that they're policing?
Yeah, definitely. So Invisible Institute did not release the name of the complainants, for example, of the records that are available on their site. And it definitely should not result in, it's risky enough to bring a complaint as a civilian against a police officer. knowing that your complaint may be not only subject you to retaliation, but subject you to other types of retaliation if not only the police officer who you've written a complaint about knows about it, but the entire police force knows about it. Of course, that would put people in jeopardy and potentially deter people from making complaints, which would then, have the deterrence effect on police misconduct data being generated generally. So it's definitely a concern. And I've spoken to a lot of groups that feel very strongly like we just want to put everything out there and make sure that everything's public and police misconduct information is public. And I think that a lot of community groups that are trying to figure out how to make their own information about police misconduct are grappling with these questions, including the groups that are making video footage and who are archiving it or making it public. They really grapple with, if they have captured an egregious instance of police abuse on video, but they don't have a relationship with that person to get their consent, then what do they do? And for the local groups that are doing Cop Watch, we've created a system where they try to contact the public defenders first and find out if they can get permission from that person, that sort of thing. So I absolutely think that there has to be consent structures in place so that the people who are the subjects of the data, as much as the police officers are, can be involved in deciding what about their information they want to make public.
So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers. And we hope you'll all stick around for